Welcome to episode 3 of my Kawasaki Z1 engine rebuild, and in this episode I'm going to build up the bottom end, fit the pistons and barrels. With the crankcases thoroughly cleaned and all the oil waste blown out, the first thing I'm going to do is unpack and fit a new cam chain. Before I fit it over the crankshaft, I'll compare it to the old original chain to make sure it's the right length, because they do come in two different lengths. So I'll give the crankshaft a quick wipe with some cloth, then fit the cam chain over the crankshaft and onto the central sprocket. I'm now ready to lift up the crankshaft and gently guide the chain down through the cam tunnel, lowering the crankshaft down into the crankcase until the bearings line up with the journals. You then have to rotate the bearings around until the holes line up with the raised pegs, until they go click and drop down into place nicely. With all the bearings finally located in their correct position, I check that the crankshaft rotates. I now pick up the C-clips and locate them in the crankcases. These are designed to hold the gearbox shafts in the correct position to each other. I then fit the input shaft and clutch assembly, locating it down into the crankcases onto the C-clip into the groove on the bearing, and just check that it rotates freely, which it does. I can now fit the output shaft, dropping that down in the same way. I have to position the gears in the correct place so I can rotate them, because the selectors aren't fitted yet, but then it all rotates really nicely. The last shaft to fit is the kickstart shaft. This drops in the rear of the engine casing and lines up with a little dowel on the bearing. The crankshaft on the Z1 engine is clamped in the centre with a separate cap. This is held with 4 bolts and can now be fitted. The 4 screws screw in easily by hand, then I tighten them up with my ratchet wrench. Once the bolts are tightened, I just check the crankshaft still rotates freely, and it does. In the bag of seals that comes with the gasket set, there's a little round seal that goes between the crankcases. This is really important because it's the main oil feed up to the pressure gallery and mustn't be left out. With all the components assembled into the top crankcase, I now get the bottom crankcase to put in the selector mechanism. The selector drum holds one selector fork, which is held in place with a single bolt in the centre and a special tab washer. With the bolt tightened, I then fold up the tab washer tangs using my pair of pliers. I then put a drop of oil on the selector drum so that it's lubricated for when I check the gear selection later on. I now fit the oil pressure release valve by first dropping in the ball bearing into the seat, followed by the spring and the retaining bolt and tab washer. I put a bit of oil on the threads just to make sure I can tighten it up nicely. Once tightened, I then fold over the tangs with my pliers. I now turn the crankcases over and fit the spring-loaded gear selector plunger. I now fit the remaining parts of the selector mechanism, first oiling the threads. This is a spring-loaded part and quite tricky to fit. With the selector mechanism assembled, I use a JIS screwdriver to check it operates nice and smoothly by rotating the selector drum backwards and forwards. I can now put gasket sealer on the crankcase joint. I use Permatex Ultra Grey. It's very similar to the original Kawasaki Bond that they used at the factory. It takes quite a while to put all the gasket sealer on the crankcase joint, and it's really important not to miss any of the stud holes. If you don't put gasket sealer around the stud holes, the oil can leak down the holes and out through the bolt heads, causing a horrible drip. With all the gasket sealer applied, I lift up the bottom crankcases and gently lower them down over the top crankcases. Engaging the selector fork over the gears as I go. A few gentle taps with a soft hammer and it's fully engaged, ready for the bolts. I first fit the larger M8 bolts. They're all different lengths, but they can only go in one place. I then fit the smaller M6 bolts. There's a few you can't get to on the other side of the crankcases, but we'll fit those later on when we turn the engine over. I now go around and tighten up all the bolts hand tight. I then go around tightening all the bolts in the sequence specified on the engine. Each bolt hole has a number stamped next to it, so you can go around following them easily. With all the bolts tightened, I check the crankshaft rotates, and it rotates really freely, so I'm really pleased about that. So now we can fit the rest of the selector mechanism. The two selectors drop in place on their respective gears, and then the shaft pushes through and locks them in place. The Kawasaki Z1 engine has a lockout mechanism in the gearbox to prevent you selecting second gear from pulling away. So you can get first and neutral, but you can't get second without spinning the shaft. So I spin the shaft as fast as I can with my fingers and thumb, then use a JIS screwdriver to turn the selector into second position so that I can check all the gears work, because I always like to check that the gears work at this stage. All the gears select nicely, so I'm really pleased about that. The kickstart spring slides in nicely from the outside. You have to engage a tang with a crankcase at the back, then twist it round and engage it onto the shaft. It's a little bit fiddly, but it's not too difficult. Then the aluminium spacer slides in the middle to hold the spring in the right place. So then I can put on the gasket. Before I fit the outer cover, I replace the oil seal with a new one. The new oil seal just presses in nicely. I can now fit the kickstart shaft cover. It's held in place with 4 screws. I temporarily fit the kickstart, and the kickstart mechanism works perfect, so I'm really pleased about that. It's It's always worth checking these systems before you go too far with your assembly. You get the whole engine built and the kickstart ratchet doesn't work. It means you've got to strip the whole engine back down. I check again that the crankshaft rotates smoothly, and it does. So now I go around and wipe off any excess gasket cement from the crankcase joint. With all the gasket sealer cleaned off, the next thing I'm going to fit is the oil pump. So I first fit a new oil seal, then gently lower the oil pump down onto its dowels, being careful to engage the gear nicely with the crankshaft sprocket. The oil pump is secured in place with 3 hexagon head screws. With the oil pump secured in place, the next thing I'm going to do is fit a new sump gasket ready to fit the sump. The large circle in the centre is for the oil filter. This has its own oil seal as well, so I fit a new one. I then fit all the screws and tighten them up, securing the sump in place. I used my T-wrench and 10mm socket for spinning the screws down. Then I go around and tighten them up. With the sump fitted, I'm now going to fit the clutch cover, so I place 2 screws in the cover and offer up the gasket ready to fit to the engine. Then I fit and tighten all the screws. With the cover fitted, I'll give it a quick buff up to see the reflection. It's really shiny. Next up is to fit the points housing. So I first put a bit of oil on the crankshaft to lubricate where the seal is going to go over. Then I fit a new gasket over the 2 location dowels ready for the points housing to be fitted. I then fit and tighten the 4 remaining crankcase screws. I then fit 2 new O-rings and the oil pressure manifold. The breather housing is held on by a central hollow bolt, but I first fit a new O-ring. I'm now ready to fit the selector shaft and output cover, so I first will offer a gasket up over the location dowels and secure in place. Then I put a drop of oil on the hole in the crankcase ready to put the selector shaft in and engage it with the selector drum. A drop of oil on the output shaft will help the seal slide nicely over the collar. A couple of taps with a soft mallet ensures the cover goes nicely over the location dowels. And now it's all ready for the screws. I then fit the drive sprocket and splash guard and then the push rod. The push rod slides in nicely. At this stage I like to check that the neutral switch is working, so I first connect a 12-volt battery to earth on the engine casings and run another wire through a bulb to the neutral switch stub. Then using the gear lever I turn the shaft into neutral and the light comes on, showing everything's working okay. I'm now ready to fit the barrels, but before I can put the barrels on the engine I need to fit some special O-rings into the bottom of the liners. This stops oil creeping up the side of the liners when the engine gets hot and the barrels expand, causing the engine to smoke. So these O-rings slide over the bottom stubs, and you just push them down with a screwdriver to make sure they engage with a slot all the way around the bottom. It's a little bit fiddly and takes a bit of time, but it's well worth it. With all the O-rings fitted, I'm now going to fit the pistons to the connecting rods. I'd already fitted and gapped the rings in the previous video, so they're all ready to fit. So I first put a bit of oil on the little end bearing. With the gudgeon pin partially inserted into the piston, I offer it up to the con rod and gently push the gudgeon pin through until it hits the other side of the circlip. I can then carefully put the circlip into this side of the piston, securing the gudgeon pin in place. I also listen for the metallic click as the circlip engages itself in the groove. The arrow on the crown of the piston always points forwards to the exhaust port, so now I can fit the other pistons using the same procedure. The inner pistons are always a bit more difficult to fit due to all the studs. With all the pistons fitted, I fit the central lower cam chain guide wheel. This fits in between the central pistons in the crankcases. I then fit the two rubber damper blocks, one each side of the shaft. I then lower the cam chain down gently until it rests on the central guide wheel. We can recover this later on once the barrels are fitted. A new base gasket is carefully lowered down over the studs and over each of the four pistons until it rests nicely on the crankcases, engaging it on the two dowels, one each side. I'm now ready to fit the barrels, but before I put them over the pistons, I put quite a bit of oil on the bores to help them slide down. The two central pistons are then positioned at top dead centre and four pieces of wood placed underneath, two each side. This holds the pistons level while I try to put the barrels on to compress the piston rings. I then carefully lower the barrel down the studs until the two central pistons just hit the bottoms of the cylinders and engage up to the first piston ring. It's then a case of gently squeezing the piston rings in with your fingers or maybe a screwdriver, applying a little tiny bit of down pressure at the same time until they engage with the balls, one piston ring at a time. This is quite a time-consuming and fiddly job, and you can't rush it. After carefully looking over both sides of the piston, I can see the rings are engaging nicely and the barrels are gradually dropping down, a bit at a time. With the piston rings on the central two pistons fully engaged with the barrels, I then tap them down gently until the outer pistons engage with the liners. Then I can remove the pieces of wood from the central pistons and gently bring the barrels down until the pistons are engaged nicely with the outer two cylinders. Then it's just a case of using your fingers or a screwdriver to get the rings to engage one at a time until the barrels drop down nicely. With all the pistons fully engaged, I use a light mallet to gently tap the barrels down onto the location dowels. With the barrels fully seated against the crankcases, I can now use a magnet to retrieve the cam chain, pulling it up through the central tunnel and making sure it's still engaged with the sprocket on the bottom. I now turn the crankshaft to bring the outer two cylinders to top dead centre, ready to fit the camshafts later on. Well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and in the next video I'll be fitting the cylinder head, fitting the camshafts, setting the cam timing and setting the valve clearances. So I'll see you all soon.